So good morning and thank you everybody for joining us today for our COVID-19 HR update. My name's Joelle Campbell and I'm joined today by my colleague Ebony Redhead. We're going to be leading you through today's session. We actually work within the market development team here in Social Business Wales, and our focus really is about supporting our business advisors and clients in the wider sector really in identifying support needs, developing tools and resources really to help you. And today's session actually came about as a direct result of client feedback. We've been having a lot of queries from clients recently around HR with the end of furlough imminent and lots of changes coming about. It seemed really timely opportunity for us to put on this session today. So we're very lucky as we enter this next stage of the pandemic to be joined by an expert really, our guest speaker for today, Karina Lloyd-Jones. Karina is a HR director and a HR advisor, and she's here today to talk about HR policies and procedures in relation to COVID and really give us a good update and some guidance. Karina joined Mentor Business as the HR director in 2013, and she's been responsible for leading the internal HR and IT department, as well as the company's HR consultancy service, Mabis. Professionally, she's been working in the field of human resources since 2003 and has previous roles, including the head of HR for two separate multinational food manufacturing companies and a large national Welsh Government sponsored body. She's a consultant here on Social Business Wales, and she's been involved in our HR and Equality and Diversity framework. She's been working on that since 2016, so many of you have probably met Karina or come into contact with her and her work. So I'm going to go briefly onto our introduction slide, and what I'm going to do quickly is just outline what we're going to cover in today's session. So we're going to start with a little scene setting and look at some of the pressures that businesses are under at the moment. And we're going to spend some time talking about what other options are out there as the furlough scheme comes to an end. Things like restructuring, how you can go about it, really the options available to you as an organisation if the new government support scheme isn't a viable option for you. We will also touch on things such as communication and staff engagement and how your business can start to plan and prepare for the next 6 to 12 months, the short term as well as the medium term, and look at worst case scenarios, which may be an option of redundancies. And finally, we're going to highlight what the key policies and procedures are going to be to help you through the next 6 months. And we'll try, as always, in our webinars to give you some really useful links and resources and tools out there and signpost you to best practice. So onto the current environment, we're just going to take a moment really to just stop and reflect where we currently are. So I think it's worth us thinking about the pressures that businesses are under at the moment in terms of this context. It's definitely been an unprecedented time for us all in terms of businesses and also us as individuals. Since March, we were all really quick to react and adapt to the changing work life and health disruptions caused by COVID-19 and the pandemic. But probably back in March, we all thought this would be a relatively temporary blip. And by now, we'd all be back on the road to rebuilding our businesses. Life would be getting back to some sort of normality. But unfortunately, though, this hasn't really been the case for the majority, and some businesses haven't even been able to reopen yet. The economic recovery has been much slower for businesses than anybody predicted, and the recent rise in cases in recent weeks and months has really seen a halt to any small shoots of growth that we've been experiencing. Coupling that with the financial package supports that were initially available in March, a lot of those are coming to an end. In the early days, the Welsh Government and the UK Government, along with banks and funders, were very quick to react and put support packages in place. They are coming back again. There are new schemes that have been announced recently, and government definitely is looking at ways to support businesses through this next phase. But there's definitely a wide scale understanding that the support isn't going to be as beneficial and as generous as it was the previous time. So there's going to be additional financial pressures really on businesses to survive this second wave. We actually recently held a webinar on the new financial support schemes available, including the Welsh Government's Economic Resilience Fund, that third phase. They are available on our COVID Hub on our website. We're going to pop links to those within our chat function, and we've also got those as the essential links at the end of the session. But it's actually a really good watch for you because it'll go through the outline and the key features of each of those supports. Naturally, yesterday, the First Minister announced that he was adding more money to the pots for those. So he's actually going to be adding an extra, it would be £300 million going into those pots to support businesses. And with his announcement yesterday of the fire break coming into effect from Friday, there's also additional support for businesses. So businesses that are forced to close, small businesses will receive a £1,000 grant. Small and medium-sized businesses that operate within the retail, leisure and hospitality businesses will have a one-off payment of £5,000. And there'll also be discretionary awards and grants for smaller businesses which are struggling. And these are for businesses that are having to close due to the fire break period. Full details are still unclear as they are hot off the press from yesterday. We will be putting up links later on to what we know at the moment. But what we're going to have to say is that the eligibility checker is still being developed. So keep checking in on that Business Wales site because that's where the information will be put up as soon as it's made available. So the First Minister announced yesterday the national fire break, which is going to see us all living under much tighter restrictions, returning temporarily to what we experienced in March. The short-term support is going to be there available to businesses, but I think there needs to be the realisation that after this 2-week period, the majority of us will probably go back under local lockdown restrictions, with 80% of the Welsh population currently under lockdown restrictions. For businesses, planning how we manage a reduced demand, reduced levels of income, how we manage that capacity in our business in terms of staffing, these are all things that are not going to go away. So I think another thing that we need to consider as a pressure really is the future delivery. And all of the mood music, certainly at the moment, is around thriving in the future, not surviving in the present. And everything seems to be predicated on the fact that we as businesses are going to know what our business model is going to look like in 6 or 12 months. We're probably going to go into that a little bit more in the session in terms of if you have to restructure and how you can plan for that from a HR perspective. But I think everybody feels almost like they're stabbing in the dark, that there are too many variables and too many unknowns. So all of these pressures here that we're all going through at the moment naturally have financial implications upon the business, but they also have operational and HR pressures which can't be underestimated or overlooked. And it can be quite overwhelming for business leaders and managers. But we'll be spending the next hour or so to examine some of the key HR considerations of operating in the current environment and really getting through this next wave of the pandemic. We'll be sharing some best practice, some legal guidance, some tips and some really practical examples of how following set procedures and processes can help you navigate these next 6 months. But before we can do all that, we really need to caveat that everything that we're saying is to date and current at this moment in time. As we all experienced yesterday, government announcement can change the situation. Things can change very quickly. So what we can only say is that the information is shared in good faith and to the best of our knowledge is up to date at this moment in time. We really, really recommend that you keep up to date on any changes and announcements. Because as we all say, it's a very, very fast moving, ever-changing situation that we're all living in at the moment. So for us to get on with the main part of today's session, I'm going to hand you over to Karina and she's going to take you through the next probably 50 minutes, an hour of today's session. But please keep putting your questions in the chat function and we'll do our best to answer them as we're going through the presentation. Some will naturally come up, but we have a dedicated question and answer session at the end. So over to you, Karina.
Thank you very much, Joel. Bore da from me from Ceredigion. I hope you're all well wherever you're based this morning. So as Joel said, I'm going to take you through some recent developments in terms of the end of the coronavirus job retention scheme and where we're going to go with this going forward. So we'll have a quick recap now on the coronavirus job retention or furlough scheme. On the 29th of May, the government confirmed that the coronavirus scheme will continue in its current form until the end of June. However, from the 1st of July, the new flexibility was introduced where employers were able to bring employees back currently on furlough back to work on a part-time basis, and the contribution rates then of the subsidiary were tweaked over the last few months. It's been a really popular scheme, and since the start of the pandemic, many businesses have struggled to maintain revenue and relied on this scheme to pay staff, meaning that they could keep employees attached to their payroll and attached to their organisation, but temporarily delegate payment of wages to the government. So when the government announced back in May that the scheme would be wound down altogether at the end of October, if you cast your memories back to May, it kind of made sense then. We were in the middle of a lockdown. Employers and employees were being encouraged to gradually return back to the workplace. And things were starting to reopen. Plans were starting to form, and the hospitality sector was supported then later in the summer through the Eat Out to Help Out scheme. However, things changed really quickly last month in September, which led to renewed concerns about unemployment rates, particularly when this current furlough scheme comes to an end. And it's not surprising, therefore, that the Chancellor last month announced the job support scheme, which commences with effect from the 1st of November. So we'll take a quick look here at what are our options at the end of furlough, but we'll go through these in more detail in the second half of the webinar this morning. So what are our main options now at the moment? If we have staff on furlough currently, what do we do now with effect from the 1st of November? Well, we could bring them back full time, which would be at our expense, at the expense of the businesses. We could furlough them for a further period, again, at the expense of the business. And I'll come on to that particular option later on in the webinar. We could bring them back on a part-time basis with support through the new job support scheme. However, given the unprecedented nature of everything that's happening at the moment, staff, unions, or even employee representative groups, completely depends on the infrastructure that you've got in your businesses, could be open to discuss alternative options when faced with potential business closures, large-scale redundancies and job losses. It's quite possible at the moment that there may be more of an appetite for discussion of possible alternatives than previously. And therefore, we could look at changing terms and conditions of employment. We could possibly offer some unpaid leave, unpaid statutory leave, or even granting unpaid sabbaticals or career breaks. We could look at changing terms and conditions of employment. I guess the main terms and conditions of employment we're looking at the moment are reducing hours and pay. And then our absolute last resort, our last case scenario should then be whether we consider redundancies. We'll work through all of these throughout the webinar today. And we'll also cover the updates to the different government schemes. Now, bear in mind when we're working through all of this information today that we've also got the coronavirus job retention scheme, job retention bonus. That's a mouthful, which was announced by the Chancellor a couple of months ago now, where employers who bring staff back from furlough and retain them in employment continuously until the end of January 2021 will be able to qualify for a £1,000 per head bonus, which will be payable after the 15th of February next year, 2021. So the bonus amount is the same for all staff, irrespective of their actual wages. And to qualify, staff must have been continuously employed since the last furlough claim. Don't have to be continuously employed since the end of the furlough scheme, just since the employer made the last claim. And they also need to meet the minimum income threshold. An important part to remember of the terms of the scheme is that the bonus will not be paid for any staff who are serving contractual or statutory notice, and that includes retirement, which started before the 1st of February. So that's quite an important one to remember. So just bear in mind the job retention bonus here now as we work through the rest of the webinar. Just to note here now, there are links to everything towards the end of the webinar, and I've included the link to the government website if you need some further information regarding the bonus in particular. So we'll start now with the Coronavirus Job Support Scheme. Difficult to remember all of these different schemes, but just to caveat as well that this information is based on the government brief fact sheet, which was in place up until yesterday, and which also notes that there's additional information on its way, but up until yesterday it was just the fact sheet. This information has more or less been directly lifted from the fact sheet with some assessment then of what the government is actually saying from me. So the scheme is limited to jobs that are considered by the government to be viable. So whereas the Chancellor was very much at the start of the pandemic about safeguarding or shielding or protecting as much jobs as possible, the message has changed now. It's very much a message of they won't be able to protect every job, but they will do their best to protect viable jobs. The measure of that is that staff must work at least a third of their usual hours. So this particular scheme is opening on the 1st of November and it runs for 6 months until April 2021. So like I said, it's designed to protect the viable jobs, and the businesses will continue to pay staff for the hours worked. And the hours worked must be a minimum of a third of their normal hours. So staff must be working a minimum of around 33% of their normal hours, which is by the government's definition then a viable job. For every hour they're not worked, the government, the employer, and interestingly, the way that the government explained the scheme, the employee share responsibility then for the hours not worked, with the government and the employer paying a third each of hours not worked. And the way the government then describe it in the fact sheet is that the employee themselves then forgoes a third and basically contributes a third then of their hours not worked as unpaid hours. So the Chancellor's overall message here was that he wanted to protect as many jobs, but he couldn't protect every job. We will be able to make these claims from December onwards through the gov.uk portal. Payments are made in arrears and will reimburse employers for the government's contribution of their third of hours not worked, with employer, national insurance and pension contributions being payable by the employers. An important part of this scheme is that staff cannot be made redundant or put on notice of redundancy during a period where an employer has claimed the grant. Now, it doesn't appear, based on the fact sheet in its current form, that that is saying that there is a ban on making staff who have been eligible and where an employer has claimed under the scheme for a member of staff, that there's a ban on making them redundant during the period of the scheme, the 6-month period of the scheme. What it seems to be suggesting is that employers would be able to move staff off the scheme and not claim a grant then for the period whereby if they were under notice of or being made redundant. The scheme does confirm, like the furlough scheme was previously, that staff can, and the term they use is cycle, that staff can cycle on and off the scheme. So like I said, it doesn't appear to be banning making staff who you've claimed for under the scheme to be made redundant, but certainly we can't be claiming for those staff while they're under notice of redundancy. So in terms of employer eligibility, as it stands, we need a UK bank account and a UK PAYE, and that we have neither the employer nor the staff need to have previously used the coronavirus job retention scheme, and large businesses will have to meet the financial assessment, but there is no financial assessment for SMEs. So good news for the majority of us in this webinar today is we will not need to pass any financial impact test or anything to be able to access the scheme, which is really good news. So in terms of the employee then, the most important part here is that they are provided with at least 33% of their hours. If an employee is provided with 33% of their hours, they'd work those hours and the employer would pay them for those hours as normal, and their normal rate of pay plus the employer national insurance and employer pension contributions. That would mean, on the whole of it then, when you take the whole scheme into consideration, that that employee working 33% of the time would actually end up receiving 78% of their normal wages. So take the example of that employee then, what would happen to the 22% of their missing time? It seems that this scheme is following a similar thread to what the furlough scheme did previously. And if you remember, I'm sure you're aware, with the furlough scheme, that staff were paid up to 80% of their wages. Now, employers could top up that if they indeed wanted to, but the minimum threshold for staff to receive was 80%. And this scheme seems to be going the same way. But because it's going the same way, it's really important that employers negotiate that or discuss that reduced pay with the staff in exactly the same way as we have done for the furlough scheme previously, and that we confirm that in writing. And what's even more important is that perhaps staff are provided with examples, and we'll work through an example in a bit, as to how the scheme works, and based on however many hours they are provided to work, how their take-home pay, from even if it's from a percentage point of view, will work out. So the minimum hours requirement is a key component of this scheme, and for employers who at the moment don't have a minimum of a third or 33% of hours to employ or to give to staff, particularly in sectors such as hospitality, leisure, entertainment, that could potentially be a situation facing the need for restructure or to change terms and conditions of employment, or possibly even redundancy. And again, we'll come on to that in a little bit. You know, the tighter restrictions and things of the pandemic are changing all the time. This week being another example, it's really difficult to plan at the moment where we're going with things and what we're going to do next. It's difficult as well to assess demand for our products and services, and then to forecast our affordability, and then map that down then to, okay, so what does that mean in terms of the resources we need? So it's really challenging, really difficult task at the moment. But like I said, the minimum hours needed for someone to be eligible in this scheme would be 33% of their hours. So we'll work through an example here. We've got Megan. Megan works 40% of her normal hours. So on the 1st of November, so let's say she's currently on furlough, and a reasonable amount of time to negotiate with someone that there's going to be a change in their furlough agreement would be at least 48 hours. So some 2 days before the 1st of November, 2 working days before the 1st of November, Megan's employer contacts her and says, look, your furlough's coming to an end now on the 31st of October. However, we're thinking of making use of the coronavirus job support scheme, which the government is starting from the 1st of November. And we can give you 40% of your normal hours. We've got enough work to be able to, that you can come to work at 40% of your normal hours. And Megan says, great, I'd love that, and I'm available to work. She would then receive 40% of her normal salary from her employer. And then the 60% that she doesn't receive is split 3 ways. It's split 20% the government would subsidy, 20% the employer would pay, and the other 20% Megan would forgo herself. And this is where the government is saying that employees contribute to this arrangement. Looking at this example, Megan would receive 80% of her normal pay, and 60% of that cost is borne by the employer, and the 20% by the government. Now, it would be reasonable to look at this from an employer's perspective and think, well, she's going to be working 40%. However, I'm going to be paying 60%. So I'm paying 20% more. Actually, when you add in employer national insurance and pension contributions to the 20% that she's not working, it's more than 50% more in employer cost to employ several people working 40%, compared to perhaps fewer people working full-time and being paid for the hours that they're actually working. So whereas on the face of this, it's positive to have a succession to the furlough scheme. It's certainly a positive thing that we have this. There's some key considerations for us as employers as to, is this scheme suitable for us? Because let's say, for argument's sake, that an employer were to assess the demand as they know now, financially forecast that, and then map their resources to that. And were to say, I can't afford for Megan to be working just 40%, but then paying her the 60%. I can't afford to be doing that. So we then need to be looking at alternative solutions, which could well be a change to terms and conditions of employment, or possibly even redundancy. Now, if redundancy costs were similar, or would outweigh the amount that the employer would need to pay under the job retention scheme, then it may well make more better financial sense to put them into the job retention scheme rather than making them redundant. And again, this is all going to have to come back to that financial assessment of each individual case. Bear in mind also that there's the job retention bonus scheme, which Megan could well be eligible for, or the employer could well be eligible to claim under come January. So these all need to be things that take play when we're thinking about, okay, where are we going with this? What are our next steps? And is this the best case for our individual organisation? Now, let's say you did go to an employee and said, look, I can't afford to use this scheme. As things are, this is where our demand sits, this is our affordability, and I can't afford to top up the additional costs of this scheme. Now, all you'd need to have as an employer would have a reasonable, thought out argument as to why you can't afford it. Because from an employee's point of view, particularly if they've been keeping up to date on the developments from a government support point of view, they might be expecting this. So I suppose my advice now, as is if you haven't already started to think about what's happening at the end of October, start having a good think about it now. Take the information from the previous Social Business Wales webinar on financial forecasting, and then map it over then to the support schemes available, and try and map out which one will help you or support you the best, when also trying to manage over the next few months and even perhaps predict how things are going to be towards Christmas and into the new year. The government have also, I'm sure you're aware, announced the extension of the job support scheme, where businesses will be required to close their premises. So with effect, so on the 9th of November, the government announced the scheme. So with effect again from the 1st of November, this scheme is not sector specific, and it does appear that larger employers will be required. Sorry, it doesn't appear that larger employers will be required to have to show any particular level of financial impact before they can assess the scheme. Also, the guidance suggests to date. But basically, under the proposals, the government will support eligible businesses by paying 2/3 of wages, so around 67%. And then there's that cap as well, if they're forced to close due to, over the coming months, over the winter months, if they're forced to close due to either a national or a local lockdown. Employers, again, will be eligible for the national insurance and pension contribution costs. It starts on the 1st of November and it's available for 6 months, and the government have suggested that they will review the arrangements in January. So in terms of the extension scheme, there are some exemptions, and the exemptions are here as they stand. I've basically just lifted these from the government website and popped them in here for you. So the type of exemptions would be businesses that are legally open, allowed to stay open, but that their business is substantially impacted by a lockdown. So for example, food service to the hospitality sector. So a food service company would be substantially impacted if there were to be another lockdown, but they would be exempt from this extension scheme because legally they are allowed to stay open, and there's 3 other examples there as well. So in terms of the coronavirus job support scheme, I've tried to summarise here really where we start with it now and what are the key decisions that we should be making now as businesses in terms of the scheme. And I would say it's whether we make use of the scheme at all. And it's all about aligning that assessment and doing that business case assessment. It's whether to access the scheme. If we do access it, are we going to access it with all of our staff, or will we just access it with some of our staff? And if it's just some of our staff, how are we going to choose the staff that we're going to use it for? And what are we going to do with those other staff? Are they just coming back on a full-time basis at the cost of the business? Or actually we're going to follow a different strategy with them, for example, negotiating changes to terms and conditions, or possibly even consulting on grounds of redundancy. We also need to be looking here at how we're going to reach agreement, what collective and individual agreements we need. Again, collective agreements will totally depend on the infrastructure that you've got in your organisations, of course, but as a minimum on an individual level, and how then that agreement is going to be cemented and confirmed in writing. Now, I've given some links later on towards the end of the webinar to the CIPD website and ACAS. They've got some really useful templates on letters and policies surrounding COVID at the moment, but also the ACAS in particular have got some really useful templates around other areas which are being primarily driven by COVID at the moment, but perhaps not COVID related directly, for example, redundancy. They're free online resources. They are, in my opinion, reliable resources as well. So take a look there. If you're looking for a letter, for example, of how to confirm to a member of staff that they will be on the job support scheme from November, I'm pretty certain that there's a letter available on the CIPD website and with ACAS. So the links to them will follow a little bit later on. So we'll move on now to restructuring and our options for restructuring. So a couple of slides ago, I summarised some options that we may have available to us at the moment. So let's put this into context again. We've got uncertainty prevailing for the foreseeable future, and we're thinking now about what do we need to do now. But we're probably thinking now about what are we going to look like over the next 3 to 6 to 12 months. Now, furlough is still an option. And given the unprecedented nature of the crisis, individuals and unions and groups might be open to discuss options such as this. So with furlough, we hadn't really heard of furlough before before COVID, we'd heard of layoffs, but they were a little dated, not perhaps as widely used now as they were back in the perhaps 80s, 90s in particular. And furlough was quite a new thing, but the whole coronavirus job retention scheme has set the way for furlough. And even though the government subsidiary is ending at the end of this month, it doesn't mean that furlough has to end. Now, you may be in a position that you can forecast that your business will recover somewhat closer to Christmas, or maybe even in the new year for whatever reason. And you may want to agree with your staff that actually, could you stay on furlough? I have no work to give them, so I can't take advantage of the job retention support, the job support scheme. I don't have 33% of hours to give them, but there's going to be an upturn and I need them. Can you afford to furlough them at your own expense? Now, at the moment, most staff are receiving 80% of their wages. You could approach your staff to say, look, we're probably going to recover somewhat in the new year. And we've done our sums and we could afford to keep you on furlough, but we'd have to reduce the pay under furlough to 50%, for example, to be able to afford this. But then come January, we've got enough hours, for example, to bring you back full time, or at least 33%, however you want to do it then from January. So you could extend the furlough. It would be totally at your own expense. And what is really, really important, in exactly the same way as you put staff on furlough originally, is that you discuss any changes in good time, in that you give notice for the change, and then you confirm that change in writing. And again, there's some really good template letters for furlough and things like that on the ACAS website. So it's an option. It's one option. It's probably not the most attractive option at the moment, particularly with the government subsidiary ending at the end of this month, but it's there. It's been set as an option through the scheme, and it continues as an option going forward. Change in terms and conditions of employment. So from an employee's perspective, this isn't as attractive, particularly as they're probably likely to be aware of the job support scheme. And therefore, employers hoping to discuss changing terms and conditions of employment. And I use pay and hours as the main example in this webinar, because it's probably the ones that we'd probably look to negotiate to change at the moment. Employers would really need to have a strong case behind why this rather than the job support scheme. So if staff refused to change, say their hours or pay after meaningful discussion and adequate time, an employer could impose the change by dismissing and re-engaging them on the new terms, or considering alternative measures, including redundancy. However, it's always advisable to try and reach agreement when changing terms and conditions of employment. I've had a question quite recently, can employers reduce pay for employees but require them to work the same hours? So this is quite a common question that I'm coming across recently. And yes is the answer. Yes, you can reduce staff's pay and ask them to work the same hours. It's going to be probably an unpopular option with staff. However, again, it's probably going to be difficult to persuade them, but it all depends on the business case for doing it. And also, it depends perhaps on the timescales for doing it. And again, going back to the unprecedented nature of everything, individuals might be more open to considering temporary solutions, say taking reduced pay for a month, if an employer can give reasonable hope that things will change. And during that time, that the employees are kept informed then as well on progress. So if you hope things will be better in, say, 4 weeks' time, but after 2 weeks we're thinking, oh gosh, this isn't panning out as we thought it was going to be, that we just keep discussing with them in terms of the changes and things that are in place. Unpaid leave is another area which we could discuss with our employees at the moment in a number of different forms. Let's say, so we've got unpaid leave could be a reasonable adjustment if an employee is disabled within the meaning of the Equality Act. So let's say you have a member of staff who's been on furlough, who is in the clinically extremely vulnerable category. Now, the public health's shielding advice in the form of the letter informing people in that extremely clinically vulnerable category came to an end in August. But many individuals have carried on with shielding activities, particularly those who were awarded the right to work from home or who were furloughed. Now, come the 1st of November, these individuals may well be required to return to the workplace. Now, if they're required to return to work and work from home, that may not be as much of an issue because they could potentially continue to shield. If, on the other hand, they're required to actually attend the workplace on the 1st of November and their employer has 33% of hours to provide them, or even full-time hours to provide them, they could in fact turn around and say, I just can't come back. You know, and if they live in Wales, Wales will be in national lockdown on the 1st of November. And what they could say is, I just couldn't dream of coming back now. I'm in this category. We're in a national lockdown. I don't feel that I feel I should still be shielding. Now, it's a tricky situation, and there is a forceful option to follow, which would be, okay, discussing, putting risk assessments and reasonable adjustments and things in place, and almost taking a hard line out. We've done everything we can. These are the reasonable adjustments that are in place, and we do expect you to come back to work, and then taking that hard line. It's not advisable in the current circumstances. What's more advisable is to discuss with that individual where we're going with this next. And a solution may be that they take a period of unpaid leave, or a career break or a sabbatical. Now, if they were to take a period of unpaid leave, it's advisable to put a start and end date on it rather than an indefinite arrangement. But let's say you say, okay, we will be in national lockdown on the 1st of November. That's a valid point. How would you feel about taking unpaid leave for a month for November? And then we'll reassess, say, mid-November and see how we're getting on for December. It's an option. They would need to agree to it. And it's advisable, again, that you confirm that arrangement in writing. They could, in fact, and I've supported a client recently where this has happened to them previously, when the lockdown measures relaxed and their business reopened, a member of staff who was previously shielding explained that they could not return to their workplace, even though they'd done all of the risk control measures from a health and safety point of view and communicated everything in advance. One individual said that they just felt they could not come due to the nature of their condition. How that actually materialised then was on the individual's first day back at work, even though there was constant discussion right up to the return to work date, that employee actually submitted a sick note. And the GP had noted on that sick note that the nature of their condition and shielding due to COVID on the sick note as the reason for that absence. The employer can't argue that doctor's opinion. So that individual actually received sick pay from the first day back of employment. Discussions have been ongoing with that employee then as per their sickness absence management procedure. So that's the policy they had to follow then. It changed a bit in the middle. The nature of the illness changed to more a mental health related issue, and it's back now to the nature of their disability. And this individual does in fact have a disability and is therefore covered under the Equality Act. So it's really important here when we're thinking of changing terms and conditions of employment that we're not just following the procedural steps that we need in terms of discussing, listening to some feedback and confirming, but we're also thinking about our wider policies. And if you've got an E&D policy, it's really likely that if you've had HR and E&D support through Social Business Wales, that you've got an equality and diversity policy. Have a read over it, Jog your memory of the 9 protected characteristics, and particularly disability, because it's really important in terms of staff returning to work, and if you're having difficulty getting staff coming back to work. So that could be an option. Sabbaticals and career breaks could be an option as well, as could be unpaid parental leave. So parents of children up to 18 years are entitled to 16 weeks, I believe it is. It's either 12 or 16 weeks. You can get the information if you're interested in it from the ACAS website. Up to the child's 18th birthday are entitled to take unpaid parental leave, which must be taken in blocks of 1 week, and we can take up to 4 weeks a year off as unpaid statutory parental leave. So that might be an option for some parents, particularly maybe parents who are caring for a child who they might be shielding, who might come into that clinically extremely vulnerable category. Might be an option to negotiate with them that they take a period of unpaid statutory parental leave, and their employment contract would continue then, because that's a statutory right. If you are agreeing unpaid leave, be clear on whether the employment continues during that time. So if it's a statutory period of leave, the employment contract would continue. If it's a non-statutory period of leave, so for example, if it's a career break or a sabbatical, agree what is happening. It's vitally important that if there's going to be a break in service, that the employee knows that before they sign up to it. So for example, if the employment will finish and will not start until a date in the future, and that is a clear break from the employer, there'd be a break in their service, and they'd lose their rights to continuous service and lose their rights to, for example, unfair dismissal, and quite importantly at the moment, redundancy pay, because you need 2 years service to be eligible to receive redundancy pay if they were in fact made redundant in the future. So it's really, really important to agree those types of things as you're ongoing. So we'll move on to redundancy. Redundancy is, it's a tricky area of employment law, and no one redundancy case is the same as the next. If we have some work, but not enough to keep everyone on pre-pandemic hours, the option would be to select some staff for redundancy. Hopefully we won't be in a situation where we're selecting the whole workforce for redundancy. That would be really, really unfortunate. Remember that there are other schemes which it would be reasonable for staff to suggest during any redundancy consultation what alternatives of you suggest. There are government subsidised schemes at the moment, and then it would be up to the employer then to say, okay, we've considered X and we can't do that because. We've considered X and we can't do that because. So just be aware that employees could quite easily ask you, what alternatives to redundancy have you considered, and can we discuss them, please? And that would be a natural thing to do during the consultation anyway. So the critical points in redundancy are the 5 steps here. But I think the main thing to note is that no one redundancy case is the same, and the circumstances then will completely, of each case, particularly in terms of the process, will totally depend as you work your way through. So we'll go through each of these points now. We'll summarise each of them and work through them. So we've got a genuine redundancy reason, and then the fair selection, and each of these bullet points. So the technical definition of redundancy is quite tricky, but broken down, it's in essence, it exists, so redundancy exists where a business as a whole is closing down. A particular part of a business, which the staff work, is closing down. Business is closing down in a particular location, or business needs fewer staff with the redundant staff skills. Now, at the moment, we're probably dealing with the 4th one there. So a business needs fewer staff with the redundant staff skills. So we don't need the level of skill as pre-pandemic levels. Hopefully, we're not looking at closures at the moment, but closures obviously do form part of the official redundancy definition. So if your business organisation is considering redundancy, your first check would be, is there a genuine redundancy situation here? Restructuring as well would be that last point. So your restructuring skills. Okay, so you need more or less of a particular skill, therefore need to restructure, and that your redundancy situation could potentially be that fourth one. You then need to look at your selection pool. As employers, the good news is we've got some flexibility in terms of defining the pool. It would be quite difficult for an employee to challenge an employer's choice where the employer has genuinely applied its mind to the issue. So for example, if you've got a manufacturing facility that needs less staff, the appropriate pool would normally be the manufacturing department. However, if there's another department, I don't know, let's say dispatch or delivery, that would normally do similar or the same work or interchangeable work. So for example, production staff sometimes deliver and delivery staff sometimes do production. It might be reasonable to extend the pool. So the main thing is to work through the points here on the slide and have a good think about the pool, who's coming into this pool, who's been affected here. So this is our demand for business, for product or service. This is what we can afford. This is what we need in terms of resources across each department. Now, who falls into the affected pool of staff? And it doesn't necessarily just have to be the department that you naturally default to. It could well be another department if, for example, you've got arrangements in place that staff tend to cover for absences, or you've got some kind of job rotation or kind of skill rotation in place. So redundancy selection criteria then would be the next thing that you'd consider. It's advisable to use a matrix, so more than one criterion, and that criteria then is objective and is not discriminative. And I've included on the slide here some typical examples of selection criteria. Should always be appropriate in the circumstances with a business justification for why that criteria is important for each individual business. When I say it shouldn't be discriminative, absence attendance record then is normally quite an objective one to use. So it's quite easy, particularly if you have robust absence reporting and recording systems in place. If you don't, or if it's not consistent, for example, amongst managers, be careful, because it could well be that one manager is more lenient on staff than another, and it's just the fact that recording isn't standard across the organisation. So just be careful on that one. But let's say that you have 3 staff and one of them has a high absence level last year, and you take that absence over to the criteria and you've got them marked X, Y, and Z, and then the absence levels. And one of them is really standing out. And you think, okay, so they're marking the lowest there. And let's move on to the next criteria. If that absence, for example, was pregnancy related, so if it was a female member of staff who had pregnancy related absence during that year, it should be discounted from the criteria. It should be taken out, otherwise you'd run the risk of falling foul of pregnancy-related sex discrimination. In the same way, years ago when I started off in HR, last in, first out, LIFO was quite a common criteria until the age discrimination came along, joined the Equality Act, at which time there were questions over it running the risk of employers falling foul of age discrimination, particularly for younger members of staff who don't have their age behind them to have length of service behind them, who could run the risk then again of falling foul of discrimination legislation. So normally now employers would use a mixture of this type of criteria, but again, read through your equality policies and refresh your minds over what have you committed to, and also what are the 9 protected characteristics. So consultation then. So for an individual consultation, for an individual redundancy process to be fair, it's crucial to have consultation. It's also vital that during the consultation, an employer doesn't assert or imply that that employee or employees will definitely be made redundant. The way to visualize it is, even if when you're planning, you cannot see any other option than there having to be redundancies, until you've been through the consultation process, it cannot be confirmed. So when you're doing the planning, so you've checked your reasoning, you've done your selection pool, you've done your selection criteria, and you've started collecting your business reasons for this, and you've thought about what alternatives you've considered, and the reasons that you've disconsidered them. Is that a word, disconsidered? Not considered them. And then you go to the staff and you pass your proposal, your planned proposal over to the staff, and you say, okay, this is the situation, and we're proposing that we potentially are going to have to make redundancies, and this is what we're planning. This is what we need to tell you now. This is what we're sharing. It's a two-way process to assist everyone. It's there to assist the employees to have the information and to be able to ask questions, but it's there to assist us to get their opinion, to see can they suggest anything else. You might have decided not to go to your staff and ask them to take unpaid leave. It's not unheard of for an employee to say during a consultation, look, would you grant me some unpaid leave? I'll go and do another job. What other jobs have you got to do? That one's a lot less pay. It's fine, I'll do it. I've had that myself a lot in the consultations that I've led, is that staff are willing to take lesser paid roles just to stay with an organisation. And it really does open up, and I think the more meaningful the consultation, the better you'll be able to predict the way forward, for a number of reasons. If the consultation isn't meaningful, it normally will not give you an indication of the level of discontent. I like to use the consultation process as a kind of risk gauge as well, because you can assess the level of discontent during the process. The conversations are difficult. They're not easy conversations to undergo at all, but you'll normally be able to identify a really disgruntled member of staff. And it normally gives you an opportunity to be able to get advice as that issue arises, rather than storing it up for a grievance at the end of the process and running the risk of legal claims of unfair dismissal or discrimination or whatever. Remember that with ACAS, even though they've got the online services in terms of templates, they've also got a helpline for employers and employees. And I quite often like to remind employees during redundancy consultation that ACAS is there for them too. So if there's anything they think that I'm doing wrong, give ACAS a call and get a second opinion. Come to the consultation and tell me what you feel I'm doing wrong, and we'll see if we can work our way through it. Okay. So in terms of the timing of consultation, if you're proposing to make less than 19 redundancies, there's no timing. Good practice would normally be about 2 weeks consultation, even for a small amount of affected employees, just to give enough time for them to be able to digest the proposals and come back with questions and things like that. If you're proposing to make 20 to 99 redundancies, the consultation must start at least 30 days before any dismissal takes effect. And if you're proposing to make more than 100 redundancies, it's 45 days before any dismissals take effect. There's some points here as to what to consider during consultation. So reasons and timescales, an explanation of the selection pools and the criteria that will be adopted, reasons why, financial packages, that type of thing. With financial packages, if employees have less than 2 years service, they are not, at the point of dismissal, they are not entitled to redundancy pay. If they have more than 2 years service at the point of dismissal, so on the last day of employment, they are entitled. If you Google government redundancy ready reckoner, a really useful online tool will come up whereby you can input an employee's age and length of service, and the tool itself and their weekly pay, and the tool itself will work out their redundancy pay for you. That's a really useful tool online. It's on the government website. So the next step then in the critical points is suitable alternative employment. And I would say that even less favourable terms of employment should be considered. So if you've got someone who's doing a fairly high skilled job now and there's a fairly low skilled job on offer on less wages, it should be suggested to them that is available. A tribunal might criticise an employer who fails to at least consider that possibility. And what you want is that you're not trying to, in your conversation with the employee, look, I'm not sure how you'd feel about this, but I want you to be aware of every opportunity we have. We do have this opportunity. Your skill is at a higher level, your experience and your knowledge, but it could buy us time that you stay with us. It's entirely up to you. There's also the option of a trial period in the redundancy legislation, whereby employees can trial out a job to see how they get on. At the end of that trial, if it works, that arrangement is agreed and they carry on in that job. If it doesn't work out, they're deemed to having been dismissed at the date that the original contract would have ended. Another key point as well in terms of suitable alternative employment, let's say you have a pool of 3, and let's say someone is on maternity, adoption or shared parental leave, it is expected, that the employer would offer them a suitable vacancy if there is one, that they're basically given preferential treatment over others within the pool. And then the last point is our fair procedure. So all the way through here, we're asking ourselves, have we followed a fair procedure? Particularly, have we followed a fair procedure before any dismissal takes effect? In terms of the right to be accompanied, although employees don't have a statutory right to be accompanied during consultation, it's really good practice to offer it. And if you don't offer it, but the employee requests it to be accompanied in a consultation meeting, it's advisable that you do allow, and ACAS would advocate that as well, that you do allow them to be accompanied. For any dismissal meeting, allow an employee the right to be accompanied, and also if a dismissal takes place, then obviously there'd be a right to appeal as well. There's some really useful templates and things in terms of consultation, dismissal on the ACAS website under their redundancy headings. Have a look if you need any documentation around this. ACAS obviously caveated to say that they need to be tweaked to each individual organisation or individual circumstance, but they're a really good resource. So we're coming to the end of the webinar, and I've included a section on key staff policies and procedures. Policies, this pandemic has stress tested every employment contract and policy that I know of: health, safety, well-being, handling furlough, unanticipated home working. And it's not just the policies that have been stress tested. We're being stress tested in the middle of all this. Changing terms and conditions can be a troublesome area, and if it's not handled correctly, the type of claims it can lead to a constructive dismissal on the basis of fundamental breach of the employment contract. So I'll just stress that you have got that free ACAS advice. They won't give advice on a legal case or the intricacies of an individual circumstance, but they will give general procedural advice, and I've known them before now to actually advise if they feel that a solicitor or an employment lawyer is needed. Some policies and procedures will need short-term fixes now, as probably you've already done over the last 5 to 6 months, and some are going to need longer-term changes, totally dependent on the way that we're going with things. The main ones I think that we need to be looking at immediately, and perhaps mapping forward a bit with them, are things like COVID-related sickness absence. So I suppose it's quite straightforward. If someone says, I've tested positive for COVID, well, you'd just follow your normal sickness policy there. You'd pay them whatever the either statutory or whatever enhanced sick pay, and you'd support them in exactly the way as your policy states. But does your policy allow for self-isolation? So what happens if someone can't work from home, and they're informed by the government track, trace and protect to self-isolate. How will your policy deal with that? These shielding staff, so going back to my example earlier of staff saying, I can't come back. I'm not in receipt of a shielding letter. The government aren't allowing that anymore, but I cannot come back. I have this condition and I can't come back. Be aware as well of mental health related conditions, because depending on the nature of those conditions, they could well be an extremely serious condition, and a member of staff could actually be defined under the Equality Act as disabled because of stress or anxiety, for example. We've had an example recently where our sickness policy says that you can self-certify for the first 7 days, and then from the 8th day, you've got to submit a sick note. So the member of staff tested positive for COVID is doing really well, thankfully. And we asked for a sick note on the 8th day. And they then produced the email that they'd received from the NHS, Public Health, to say that they tested positive for COVID, and had said that their GP won't issue a sick note until the 15th day, because that email covers them for the first 14 days. Okay, so that's something new I've learned over the last month or so, is that so if an email confirming someone has tested positive actually covers them for 14 days. Bear in mind as well that the coronavirus sickness pay rebate scheme, so we've got another scheme here, and the link again is at the end of the webinar. Eligible employers can claim back up to 2 weeks statutory sick pay paid to current or former employees as a result of COVID, and the link to that is at the end of the session. Home working policies is another one that we should be looking to, and I think with home working, we put, for those of us who needed to work from home, say over the last 6 months or so, we put business continuity plans in place, and we just all went home and we just did the best, and we supported staff as much as we could, and we've generally some employers have provided equipment or allowed staff to take their desks home with them, or screens and things home with them. But now I think we're faced with the possibility that we could be home for a lot longer. And how are we going to deal with that? Is our infrastructure okay? Have staff got enough equipment? Would we, if we were in the office, be doing workstation assessments? And have we been putting them off because people are working from home and we don't know? We can't go to their homes to check their desks. So just be thinking about, the longer term now mapping of the whole home working and health and safety and well-being side of things as well. In terms of health and safety, particularly if you're bringing someone back to a workplace, it's vital that there's a risk assessment in place, and that risk assessment is followed stringently to control any risk factors. And there's some excellent resources on the Health and Safety Executive website. They've got a number of COVID-related workplace risk assessments, examples for different types of businesses, which are really good as a template if you're looking for a risk assessment. And the HSE have also got some other really useful tips on adequate PPE and things like that to be provided as risk control measures. Try and bear in mind that employee well-being should be considered as part of the whole health and safety landscape in terms of, so it's not just looking at the physical well-being, physical safety, look at psychological safety, and perhaps the impact of the pandemic on just the general mental health of the workplace and of society as a whole. Disciplinary grievance and performance management, basic things like, how do we hold meetings? So if we need to conduct investigation meetings, how do we hold them? If we need to hold a disciplinary meeting, how do we hold them? Is this remote setup okay? And does your policy allow for that? So just have a read over them, review them, and see, well, actually, if I had a grievance today, I wouldn't be able to do that. Okay, so let's think, how would I do it today? And if in any doubt, reach out for some support. You're attending this webinar today, I assume, because you're supported by Social Business Wales in some way, or you're familiar with the Wales Co-op in some way. You've got an amazing organisation behind you who can offer you loads of support. So if you're not sure, or if you're just feeling quite overwhelmed with the information, contact your business advisor or contact Social Business Wales or Wales Co-op. And I'm sure if they don't have a project or a program that can help you at the moment, I'm sure they'll signpost you to the right source. Redundancy, have a look at your redundancy policies if you've got any in place. And again, just have a think about, okay, so if I had to make someone redundant, I'd probably have to meet them remotely maybe. Or if I was willing to meet them face-to-face, would they be willing to meet me face-to-face? And that type of thing. Data protection, carrying data from the workplace to home and back again, cyber security. You might have firewalls in place in your workplace. It's unlikely that your staff have got firewalls or adequate firewalls in place anyway at their homes. So just start to think now, and this is perhaps more medium to longer term. Okay, if we're going to be home for another year, do I need to be thinking about that type of thing? You know, do staff understand how their routers are set up at home? Do they know how to tighten up on that type of thing on the IT elements of this? Already covered E&D, familiarise yourself with E&D, particularly in terms of your 9 protected characteristics, and just keep them on your periphery all the time. And your employment contracts, you know, let's move away from pay and hours. I've used that all the way through the webinar. Let's think about location. So you might have staff who've gone to work from home temporarily, and you confirm that in an email or in a verbal communication with them at the start of lockdown. Can you go home until further notice, please? Fine. Now, you might decide there's no point in them coming back to the office or this workplace. We might as well actually let that workplace go. We're paying rent for it, or we're paying whatever. It's adding to our costs. We might as well shut it down and keep them at home for the time being. What's your decision now? Is your decision now that you're moving staff from a contractual point of view to be home-based permanently, and therefore you set that in stone? Or is it a possibility in 6 to 12 months when things change that you might actually reopen another workplace or another office, in which sense, probably best advised to change your contract to say you'll work from home until we open an office which is in commuting distance from your home. So try and think, you know, if I'm making a change now, is it going to impede me in any way or in the future? It's not to say you can't change it again in the future, but just try and map forward as much as you can, which is really difficult at the moment. So at the end now of the session, and I've included this slide on leadership because this webinar today isn't normally the format that I take. I've been sharing a lot of information with you that's procedural and legal, and I try normally for things to be a little bit more upbeat in terms of content, but this is information that you need, and it was important to try and get the information over to you as clearly as possible in the time that we had. Leadership, this is a really nice little article on People Management website, which looks at the workplace. So it looks at stabilizing and healing, reconnecting and enabling and recalibrating the workplace. And when I was reading through it, I thought, yeah, do you know what? We work, we're in the third sector, where social business says, we've grown from ethics and values. And this is all really overwhelming. I'm overwhelmed most days, and I don't know the answer to things most days. But the best we can do is map our way forward and try and hold true to our values and ethics as much as possible, but try and look after ourselves as well, and be kind to ourselves and be kind to the people around us. There's a lot of procedural and legal stuff to work our way through, to navigate our way through, and it's hard, it's difficult. There's so much to take into consideration. But there's so much stress at the moment on us as individuals, on organisations, and on our societies. It's putting us under enormous threat in terms of just health and well-being in general. So just I thought this article is quite a nice one. Have a read over it. It's really short. It shouldn't take more than 5 or 10 minutes to read. But it just looks at, you know, about caring communications and perhaps looking at the way things are done now and the actions and decisions we take now and the impact then that could have in the future, and particularly in terms of employer brand and things like that, and you know how perhaps our actions now could either pay back for us tenfold in the future in terms of motivation and commitment, or could bite us in the bums in the future in terms of disengagement and demotivation. What we've got in terms of the resources at the end here are a couple of 6 examples of some organisations, again pulled from people management primarily, I think, of organisations that have adapted quickly and really well to the coronavirus crisis, with the Wales Co-op at the top of the list there. Derek Walker, their chief exec, has written a really good blog on how they managed in the early days of the crisis. It's a good read. So there's some couple of examples there. They're not long at all. They don't take a long time to wade through. They're just some examples of how people have adapted over the last few months. I think that's it from me now. I can see the chat moving on quite busily as I was talking there, so I'm sure there are some questions. So I'll hand you back now to Joelle and Ebony. Thank you very much for listening. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Oh, thank you very much. So can you go on to the next slide, please, Karina? That was an amazing amount of information that I think we've managed to glean from today's session. We do appreciate that it can be overwhelming, the amount of information that we have shared with you. So we've put together some useful links. We've also put together a Padlet, which we will share with you later, which has the links in as well. And Karina's worked on a checklist for us as well, which is going to be available later on in the week. So hopefully that'll be a really useful tool that will just act as like an aid to this process. So it will come in really handy for you, and we're including links in as well. So we've tried our best, as always, to pull together some really important links for you. Again, our warning that these are as up to date as possible as of yesterday, but they could be subject to change. So it is really worth checking on these quite regularly. So we've put everything from the new job support scheme through to the announcement on the fire break in Wales and financial support available, including the eligibility checker. Again, all of these will be available for you along with copies of the presentation, and the recording will go on our website and our YouTube channel, so you'll be able to dip back into relevant sections as you need to. I am going to pass it over to my colleague Ebony now, who's been compiling lots of your questions, and we're going to put you in the mastermind seat. Over to you, Ebony.
Thank you, Joelle. We've had quite a few questions, but I'm just very conscious of time, so I think we'll have to answer them as well. You're going to be doing the answering, Karina, sorry, but as briefly as possible so we can get through them, I think. We've had a few questions in relation to the job support scheme. One question came through: can you still claim, I'll deal with the job retention scheme bonus first, and then I'll move on to the job support scheme. Can you still claim the £1,000 job retention scheme bonus if the member of staff will by then be on maternity leave?
Yes, I believe so.
I'm assuming as long as that threshold has been reached in terms of income, that they'd still be eligible, wouldn't they?
Yes, I believe so.
So a question in relation to the job support scheme, and we've had a few good questions on this. So it's whether an employer can opt to pay a higher contribution, as we saw with the furlough scheme, or the job retention scheme as it's officially called. So for using your example of Megan, she works 40% out of her hours. Does that mean Megan has to forgo the 20%, or can the employer, if they're able to, pay an additional 40% and the government 20%, so that Megan would get 100% pay? Would they still be eligible on the scheme?
So I did some research on this point last week, and in the fact sheet as it currently stands, it doesn't mention anything on topping up. I can't see, this is my personal reason now, so I'll caveat it until the further information comes. I can't see why they'd stop an employer from topping up in the same way as they didn't stop us topping up on furlough. But in the current guidance as it stands doesn't look to say that it restricts employers from topping up at all, no. So my opinion of it as it currently stands is yes, but we really do need to have the additional meat on the bones that's probably will be with us by the end of the week in terms of that scheme.
Okay, thank you for that, Karina. Just a point of clarification on the job retention bonus eligibility, really. We had a question which was, would we be eligible for job retention bonus as long as we claimed on the job support scheme at some point? We wouldn't have to claim, or we wouldn't have to claim consistently for the whole period. I think there's just a bit of confusion about schemes here, because obviously it's the furlough scheme or the job retention scheme that staff had to be on, really, to then be able to get that bonus. Isn't that correct, Karina?
Yeah, so my understanding is that it's linked. Staff don't have to be on the job support scheme at all. Again, my understanding based on the fact sheet as it is. And if you look at that link and go to the fact sheet, it's a couple of pages for quite a big scheme, but that's exactly how the furlough scheme was to begin with. And then it puffed up, didn't it? And we got all of that additional information and they updated it all the way through. Yeah. So yeah, my understanding is staff don't have to be on the job support scheme. So the scheme that's starting on the 1st of November, staff don't have to be on that at all for you to be eligible for the job retention bonus. But they do have to have been continuously employed since you last claimed for under the furlough scheme. So let's say that your last furlough, someone's with you until the 31st of October, and then on the 1st of November, they come back to work full time. There's no change. You don't make use of the job support scheme at all. My understanding is that in January, you'll be able to put a claim, providing that you meet the minimum income threshold and things for that employee. If, on the other hand, your last furlough claim was back in June, and they've been back at work since then, they've been working for you, my understanding is that you'll still be able to claim a bonus for them, providing that they've been employed by you from June, from when you made your last claim until January. That's my understanding on the retention bonus scheme.
Brilliant. Thanks for that clarification, Karina. We have a question on annual leave. So obviously, as annual leave has been accrued during furlough for many staff, how can an employer, and it's inverted commas, force their employees to take annual leave before the new entitlement year begins?
Before the new entitlement year begins. Okay, so this annual leave is a cost to the employer. So when an employee takes annual leave, they're paid for that time away, obviously. So one way of doing it is, let's say that you have someone on furlough now, and you could probably take them back from January, let's say. And so you've got November and December. So what are you going to do with that? You could ask them to take a period of annual leave. You're allowed to request an employee to take a period of annual leave, but you've just got to give them adequate notice. What wouldn't be reasonable or proportionate, for example, would be, let's say if November is the first month of your annual leave year, and you ask them in November to take half of their annual leave. An employee would think, well, actually, why would I do that? That means that I've only got a handful of days then to take for the remainder of the year. It needs to be worked out depending on the pro rata entitlement up to that date, I would say. That's how we do it anyway. So let's say you're halfway through your annual leave year, and let's say staff have 30 days. Just for ease of my calculations in my head. So let's say you're halfway through the annual leave year and you've got an annual leave year of 30 days. And you'd calculate up to that point how many would staff have accrued? 15 days. And how many have they not taken? 15 days. You could give them notice, right? We're restarting business in January. We anticipate that we'll need you back. We've got a big project that we need to get on with and had some good news. However, we need to operationally manage this, that we don't have staff returning to work in January, and we are inundated with requests for annual leave that's been accrued and you haven't taken while you've been on furlough. We're therefore giving you notice that between this date and this date, we're requesting that you take annual leave of X amount of days, which is your prorated entitlement up to that point, and you'll still have then the prorated entitlement for the remaining time to take when you are in fact back. you are allowed to give notice to staff to take annual leave, providing it's reasonable and proportionate request.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Karina. We've had a question in relation to travel and expenses and obviously new home working arrangements. So we've got a question we've restructured during COVID-19 and are working from home, but staff are required to travel to Cardiff for meetings in the office. So this has brought up some confusion in terms of what they can claim for in terms of expenses, especially staff that are west of Swansea. And what would you advise for that?
Right, on this one, the way I did, I'm putting myself in my consultant hat on, I'd normally ask to see your current expenses policy and what does it say. So I'd look to see what does your current expenses policy say, and is there anything in your employment contract that mentions expenses in any way. In the absence of anything in your policy, so nothing at all, which, well, you might not have an expenses policy. In the absence of a policy or anything in the employment contract, I would say that even normally you'd expect a member of staff to be able to finance a normal commute to work. Normally your expenses policy would define what a normal commute to work is. So let's say the mileage from Swansea to Cardiff was, how much is it, guys? 30, 40 miles? Would that be defined as a normal commute to work? And is it reasonable to request employees to be able to pocket that themselves? So I suppose that's the first question that you'd ask. If your answer there is yes, take that suggestion to staff, is that you'd normally be required to commute to work, and we see that this is a reasonable commute to work. It's X amount of miles and it's X amount of time. You used to travel X amount of miles to Llanelli or to Carmarthen. It's just going in the other direction. So take the whole picture of it. If on the other hand, it's quite a long way to drive, you might want to offer them the business reimbursement rates that HMRC suggest. So if you Google HMRC, I don't know them off the top of my head, business mileage rates, HMRC, you'd be able to see how much they suggest then in terms of business mileage reimbursement rates, and you might be able to just offer them that per mile, or come to an agreement with them to say, okay, we're not reimbursing you for the first 20 miles because that's quite a normal commute to work one way. We're not reimbursing you for the first 20 miles one way, but any mileage after 20, so it's 40 miles, we'll reimburse you 20 miles, so you're meeting them halfway. Really have a think about it. If they've presented you with the argument, have a think about it. Have a think about your affordability. What policies and procedures have you got in place? And take a suggestion to them. You'd normally reimburse a commute to work if it's over and above a normal commute to work.
Thank you, Karina. We had a comment from Keith. Thank you, Keith. It was in relation to sort of go-to advice on HR for our sector, really. I would say we've got Social Business Wales advisors covering every region of Wales. My suggestion would be always to just contact your local business advisor initially and have a chat with them about whatever issue it is or query, see if they can help. And if they can't, they are really well equipped to signpost effectively to other sources of information and advice and support services. So absolutely, it is something that the sector needs, and those business advisors are on hand. And if they can't help directly, they generally know where to send you. So that would be my recommendation on that one. I think that's all we've probably got time for in terms of questions. So thank you to Karina. That was an excellent presentation, an excellent session, so much information in there. And as Joelle said, we've got hands clapping, which is excellent. As Joelle said, we've put together all the resources. We're going to be sending you a Padlet which contains the slides, It will also contain, once it's up on YouTube, the live recording, and obviously any links that have been mentioned during the session as well will be in there. So if you need any further help following this, as I said, contact your business advisor. If you don't have a business advisor yet with SBW, Social Business Wales, contact us on the telephone number there or the email sbwinquiries@wales.coop. Check out the COVID-19 hub that we've put together that we're constantly updating with resources. And yeah, I think that's it from us today. I hope that's been useful, and we hope to see you again soon. Thanks for taking part, everybody. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Who will?